Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gil Epen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gil@epen.info. My guest today is Professor Arik Levinson, who is Professor of Economics at Georgetown University. He's known for his research in the fields of energy economics and environmental economics. Welcome, Arik.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. So I want to start with one of your earlier papers in 2001, the simple analytics of the environmental Kuznets curve, in which you say evidence suggests that some pollutants follow an inverse U-shaped pattern relative to countries' incomes, a relationship that has been called an environmental Kuznets curve. So this is the idea, Arik. I don't know much about this, obviously. So the low-income countries have low consumption and hence low pollutants level. And the high-income countries have high consumption, but they have technology to take care of it. So we have a group of countries sort of stuck in the middle who is creating the highest amount of pollution. Is that true?
I think that you captured it pretty well. The idea goes back to the early 1990s when some researchers at the World Bank noticed this pattern, that in the early 1990s, data was first starting to come in about pollution levels all over the world. And researchers at the World Bank noticed that the poor countries don't have much economic activity, and so they don't have much industry and don't have many cars, and so they don't have much pollution. And the middle income countries are the ones that were industrializing and getting worse and worse pollution. And the richest countries in the world, like the United States and Japan and Northern Europe, didn't have much air pollution and clean water. And that was on the one level, that was a revelation, because before that, there was a sentiment among a lot of analysts that economic growth and environmental degradation went hand in hand. And so if we're going to solve the environmental problem, we would have to slow economic growth.
Yeah.
And this documentation of this pattern showed that, at least on the surface, that wasn't true.
Yeah.
But as you intimated in your introduction, this could be for a lot of reasons. It could be that poor countries make a mistake and they have bad policies and then they fix it.
Yeah.
Or, some conservatives pointed to this pattern and said, oh, this is evidence that cleanup is automatic and all we have to do is get rich and then the environment will take care of itself.
Yeah.
And some anti-trade activists pointed to this and said, what's really going on here is the rich countries are just importing the polluting products that are being now manufactured elsewhere. And so they're just moving the pollution around the world, and it's not solving the problem. And so just documenting the pattern doesn't give us any policy implications because it's consistent with all of those explanations. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So you said a few things there. So I want to dig deeper on that. So one of the hypotheses is that when you get rich, you have more options. You can basically pay somebody to take your pollution, and you probably pay sort of the middle income countries because because you can transact with them. Maybe I'm just making this up, Eric. So, do we have evidence that that is happening?
It turns out that evidence is very hard to find, and I've spent a lot of time looking for it. It's an intuitive idea that America and Northern Europe and wealthier countries have imposed strict environmental regulations, and that has shifted the polluting industries overseas, and now we import the polluting products from those other countries. And it's very hard to find evidence of that. And I think it may be happening, but it's really small.
Yeah.
One of the reasons it's hard to find evidence of that is that the most polluting industries aren't really transportable easily. Cement is hard to transport. Paper and pulp and paper is a very polluting industry, but it tends to be located near the trees.
Yeah.
The chemicals industry is located near ports where there's oil and gas and so forth. And so it's very hard to trade in those products.
Right. Yeah. And so the other sort of idea was that the developed countries have technology, so they can take care of it. You just mentioned your daughter is just flying out of India. I remember, India and China both had this problem, and both are, China's obviously gone a lot further than India. And we have a major pollution problem, for example, in India, right? And so that sort of fits that narrative, I think.
I think one of the things that's going on here is that governments solve local pollution problems first. So one of the first pollution problems every civilized society solves is local drinking water, right?
Yeah.
You can't defecate in the stream and survive as a society. Then local air quality, and then transboundary air pollution that goes across states and countries is harder to solve. And the worst problem of all, of course, is climate change, because there's no global governance. And so if you think about a small town, if a small town is poor and they have really good government, they solve the local environmental problems, but they might pollute in such a way that it harms the neighboring town.
Yeah. So localization of pollution it's not going to work, right?
Right.
And so is that sort of the issue that we are dealing with, that it is? So let me ask. So what do you find from the data? So it's not really income; it's other factors that is driving this observation.
So the thing that Jim and I wrote down in this paper called "The Simple Analytics of the Environmental Kuznets Curve," it's a really simple economic model. It's called a Robinson-Crusoe model, named for the castaway, the literary castaway. And the idea is that there's an economy of one person on one island, and he does something for his sustenance. Let's call it picking coconuts. And he's the sole person on the island, so he's both the employee and the employer, if you want. And to add pollution to the mix, we suppose that everything that he does also creates pollution. So think every coconut creates a coconut shell that's litter on the beach. And if Robinson Crusoe is poor, then he poor, by which I mean it's really hard for him to get coconuts. There aren't many trees around, and he can barely feed himself. Then he doesn't devote any time to cleaning up the shells.
Right.
And the richer he gets, the more polluted the beach gets. But at some point when he's rich enough, which is that there are lots of coconut trees around, then he will be well-fed and decide to devote some of his time to cleaning up the beach. Gets beyond that, the cleaner the beach gets. And that's the pattern in the environmental Kuznets curve. That's the same pattern that the World Bank noticed. This is obviously a metaphor, but it's a metaphor that's interesting because there's no international trade. So you can see this pattern without exporting or importing pollution from abroad. It's economically efficient. It's not that Robinson Crusoe made a mistake, because there's only one person in the economy, so it must be efficient.
Yeah.
And it's also not a sign that it's automatically it's necessarily efficient, because if you think of a small island with 10 people on it, each acting their own best interests, they're each going to pick coconuts for themselves, but they're also going to litter the beach and not care about it because of each other. And so the paper is a simple economics model, and what it says is that the data that we see don't have any policy implications.
Yeah. And so
I guess that was revelatory at the time, because people were writing op-eds in the Wall Street Journal and other places drawing policy implications from this observation at the World Bank.
Yeah, so let me understand this, Arik. So it sounds to me that every country is sort of trying to localize pollution in this case. So they're cleaning up their neighborhoods, they're making the air more breathable, they're making the water more potable. So sort of a localization of pollution, but pollution is not necessarily localizable. And we see the same thing in the COVID-19. I want to get your perspective on this. It's a worldwide pandemic. And if I have a country with 20 million people, I vaccinate 15 million of them, and I say I have herd immunity, that's not going to last, because you got 8.3 billion people out there. And pollution is sort of in a similar vein, isn't it?
Well, the parallel I would draw is that wearing a mask and becoming vaccinated are largely public goods.
Yeah.
Most of the benefit of wearing a mask is that you don't make other people sick. And most of the benefit of getting vaccinated is that you're not going to transmit a disease to other people.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to induce people to do those things. And the environment, and climate change in particular, is also that way. Most of the benefit of taking a shorter shower or buying a more cost-effective, more energy efficient car is a benefit that's enjoyed around the world, not by the person driving the car or taking the shower. So we have to find a way to get people to do things that are in the global public interest. And I think the pandemic has illustrated that its persuasion isn't that effective. It's not that effective in the United States.
Yeah. So that's a big insight. And so if I understand you correctly, if you see a problem that is not necessarily localizable, but there are behaviors that are necessarily localizable, and it has worldwide impacts, albeit small, but in aggregate, it has positive effects.
One of the things I had hope for, which turns out not to be true, is that local pollution is correlated with global emissions. So, for example, factories that emit carbon also emit sulfur dioxide. Sulfur dioxide is a local pollutant, carbon is a global pollutant. And so India and China are suffering terrible local pollution, and their own citizens are gonna demand action. And if cleaning up sulfur emissions and cleaning up particulate emissions, which are local, also reduces carbon emissions, that's good for the planet. And so Beijing's brown skies, I thought, was good news for the planet, because the citizens of Beijing would demand action, and that would result in mitigating climate change.
Yeah.
That turns out not to be true, because there are lots of ways to reduce local air pollution that don't reduce carbon emissions. For example, you could move the factories away from Beijing.
Right.
That solves the problem in Beijing, but it doesn't solve the problem for the planet.
Yeah, so when you have a global problem like environment or COVID-19, the sort of the instinctual reaction of countries and counties and states will be to localize it, but it's not really going to solve the problem.
It's not necessarily going to solve the problem, and the technology. The U.S. has, during the Obama administration, proposed a bunch of policies that would reduce carbon emissions, and any policy that reduces carbon emissions, the technology is weirdly asymmetric in that technologies to reduce carbon emissions also happen to reduce local air pollution. And so anything that you do for the planet, you get a local benefit from. But the reverse is not true. And so the Obama administration tried to sell its climate policy as, look, it has all these local benefits. And that's true. But the reverse is not true. In that cleaning up the local pollution doesn't necessarily reduce carbon emissions globally.
Yeah, so given all of that, Arik, so if you were to formulate a policy, I know that you were involved with the Obama administration. Are you involved with the Biden administration or
no?
No. So
I'm free to. I don't think I would be speaking on a podcast if.
And so,
at least
if you
not so freely.
Yeah, I mean, if you had to formulate a policy today, and I'm talking about pollution specifically, what would be the characteristics that you would want to be in it?
Well, I'm an economist, and since 1920, when Pigou wrote his treatise on this, economists have recognized that the most cost-effective way to reduce pollution is to tax it.
Yeah.
What we call it internalizing the externality, make people pay the full social cost of their activities. So if you're driving to work, you pay the cost of the gasoline, but you also pay the cost that the pollution imposes on everybody else.
Right.
And that is hard to, politically, that seems to be hard to enact, not only in the United States, around the world. We can talk about that if we talk about some of these other topics.
Yeah, so let's do it. So you have a recent paper, energy efficiency standards are more regressive than energy taxes, theory and evidence. You say economists endorse taxes as a cost-effective means of reducing pollution, but policymakers raise concerns about their regressivity or disproportionate burden on poorer families, preferring instead to regulate energy efficiency. And we see this all the time, right? So the U.S. is sort of a distinct system where nobody likes taxes. Anytime somebody says tax, you say that is a bad. You can't do that. You have to have better policies than taxes. But you find something entirely different here, right?
Right. So you asked the question, what would my policy be? My policy would be a tax or something that emulated a tax. The benefit of a tax is that it equates the incremental cost of every unit of pollution reduced across all the different activities. So you can think of it this way: if we're doing two different activities to reduce pollution, and one's really expensive per unit of cleanup and one's really cheap per unit of cleanup, we should do more of the cheap one and less of the expensive one, and we could get just as much cleanup at the same cost. And that's the benefit of a tax. It gets an outcome like that. Tradable permits, same thing. Now, as you point out, people don't like taxes. And one of the reasons they don't like taxes on environmental goods is that let's think of the gas tax. Low-income people pay less in gas taxes than high-income people, but they pay more as a share of their incomes because their incomes are lower. So if you're poor and you drive half as much as a rich person, but you have only a tenth the income, that tax is a bigger burden on you than the rich person. And so people don't like that nature of the gas tax, that it's disproportionately falling on poor people as a percentage of their incomes. But that misses 2 points. The first is that it ignores what we do with the revenues. If we took all the revenues from the gas tax and we gave it to low-income people, that would, of course, make them way better off. And there are many proposals on the table right now to impose a carbon tax, to refund the money. So carbon tax, for every activity that you undergo, you're taxed according to the carbon content of the activity, using electricity, driving your car, cooking on your stove. But then the revenues are all pooled and handed out to households on a per household basis or a per person basis, regardless of how much electricity or gas you consume. And so since low-income people use less energy than high-income people, they would pay less in taxes and receive the same benefit check. High-income people would pay more in taxes and receive the same benefit check. And so this is effectively a transfer of income from high-income people to low-income people. And conservatives don't like that proposal because it's income redistribution. So there's got to be politically some happy medium between returning all the money per household or per person, which would be income redistribution, and just taxing people on the basis of their gasoline consumption or energy consumption and putting it into the general revenues. Some happy medium between those should be able to thread the political needle and get it passed.
Yeah. This is very intuitive from an economics perspective. And it's sometimes difficult for general public, to fall behind on. And policies ultimately depends on how people internalize this information. I sometimes, think about this, Arik. In corporations, in business schools, we teach the investment and financing decisions have to be separate. But most managers in companies don't actually do that.
Sure. And I think in this case, if the gas tax or the carbon tax is the right thing to do economically, then politically, maybe we can use the revenues in such a way that gets that passed. So get the stakeholders, make electricity consumers not worse off. Get the unions on board by building high-speed transit or whatever it is they want. Use some of the monies to offset the capital gains tax or the corporate income tax or whatever would get conservatives on board. There's a big pot of money there that could be used politically in a way that would get the gas tax passed. And if the only goal is to get the gas tax passed so we solve climate change, then those are achievable. But I did want to say, sorry.
No, go ahead.
The environmental justice, the inequality of the gas tax and its burden misses the fact that it ignores what we do with the revenues. But it also misses what we do instead of the gas tax. So in the United States, what we've done instead of a gas tax is standards for vehicles, fuel economy standards for cars, emissions standards for cars. And those make cars more expensive. So if you think about it this way, the gas tax makes driving the car more costly. The fuel economy standards makes buying the car more costly. And it's not obvious which one is better or worse for low-income people versus high-income people. And in the paper that you cited, energy efficiency standards are more regressive than energy taxes. I do the calculation for the United States and say that on a dollar-for-dollar basis, the thing that we've done instead of a gas tax is actually worse for low-income people than a gas tax would be.
Yeah. I mean, it's really, really interesting. So, one of the problems we have, obviously, is that politicians have 4-year horizons. Their only objective function, their only factor in their objective function is to get elected again. And so they want to go out and say, hey, I did this. I implemented an energy efficiency policy, and I didn't raise your taxes, and so vote for me. But what you're showing here is that the real, if you really look at it from an economic perspective, the optimum strategy is to tax. And if you believe it's regressive, there are other opportunities for us to make it less regressive by income. As you say, conservatives don't like the term income redistribution, but really making it less regressive, there are ways to do that. And so it's almost like, from an economics perspective, you have to solve the problem optimally and then figure out the objections to it to take care of it from a societal perspective. But I think it's difficult to do that with politicians having 4-year horizons to get elected.
It is, and I'm conflicted as an economist because I think what we should do is preach the truth, or what we see as the truth, or what we understand to be the truth about the cost effectiveness. And yet, if it's never gonna, are we letting the perfect be the enemy of the good? The Biden administration is about to roll out a whole series of proposals with the aim of cutting carbon emissions in half by the end of the decade. I can't imagine any of them are going to include a carbon tax. I could be wrong, but I would be surprised given the rhetoric so far. And so, are we as environmental economists concerned about the state of the planet? Are we going to oppose that on the grounds that it's not the best possible plan, or are we going to stand up and cheerlead for it because it's the best thing that could be politically feasible? And if we do that, are we really, as economists, practicing political science without a license? I mean, I have no insights into what's politically feasible and what's not.
Yeah, but what's politically feasible is one thing, but your students understand this idea that the beauty of taxes, especially gas taxes, is it's a consumption tax. It allows us to fully, not necessarily fully, it allows us to internalize the real cost of driving. And those types of solutions are more likely to be optimum. And so I know that economic students understand this, but as you say, politicians, maybe they understand it, but they don't really want to do anything about it.
And there are other things going on, right? Not everybody. Right. I sort of agree with you that I've thought my job as a college professor is to teach generations of college students this idea, and they would go out and be voters, and some of them would even be politicians, and that enough of them would go and they would enact good policies. It doesn't, that's pretty naive, I think. Well, one of the things that's going on is that if I enact a standard that requires that cars be more energy efficient or emit less pollutants, that's kind of an invisible tax. It's the price of the car goes up, but you don't necessarily notice it. Whereas the gas tax, people notice gas prices. They're in large font on every street corner in America. And you see, it's the only consumption item where I stand there with my hand on the hose watching the dollars tick up, cling, cling, cling on the pump as I watch my credit card be charged. So it's really salient for people in a way that other costs aren't. And so a hidden cost, like a fuel economy standard for a car or an emission standard for a car, may be more politically palatable.
Yeah, I mean, I have debates, Arik, with fairly educated people, engineers with PhDs and so on. And oftentimes, if I take your argument, I won't be able to convince them that CAFE standards and such regulations are less efficient. So make your case. Make your case in more quantitative terms. So why do you think carbon taxes and gas taxes are more efficient for society?
Two reasons. One's very simple, which is that faced with a gas tax, there are many ways that I can respond and reduce the pollution that comes from my vehicle. I can demand cleaner, more energy efficient cars. I can drive less. I can carpool. All of those things are actions we want people to take. If I impose a CAFE standard, a fuel economy standard, that only does one of those things. It makes the car more energy efficient, and it leaves the other ones off the table. So in that sense alone, the CAFE standard is more costly. But there's a worse problem with the CAFE standard, which is that the CAFE standard makes driving cheaper. So once I've purchased the car, it's now cheaper for me to drive because it's more energy efficient. And so that undoes some of the goal of the policy. And there's an economist at UC San Diego named Mark Jacobson who's estimated that the cafe standard costs 6 times as much per per gallon of gasoline reduced than a gas tax would cost. Or flip that on its head, for every dollar of expenditure on a cafe standard, we could have gotten 6 times as much pollution cleanup and gasoline reduction with a gas tax.
Yeah, I mean that's a big factor, 6 times. So what is missing? I don't know. I don't know much about how politicians or administrators make their decisions, Arik. So, but when they make these models, are they really considering, as you say, the behavior changes associated with the policy change? So I get a fuel efficient car and I, drive it around two times as much as I would have otherwise. I have completely negated what was originally intended.
Right. I don't know that the response is that large. The cost benefit analyses that the Department of Transportation and the US EPA do now in advance of changes to the fuel economy rules, they factor in some response. Maybe it's 10%. So the car is cheaper to drive, and people drive. For every dollar of cost savings, you'll drive 10% more, something like that. It's not, but it's a back of the envelope calculation. It's a very hard behavioral. It's a very hard behavior to estimate.
Yeah. So when you were with Obama administration, so do we have, from a policy perspective, Arik, it seems to me that we need some sort of a normalization. We need some sort of a valuation process for every policy suggestion. So what's the net present value to society type calculation for every policy suggestion? We have alternatives, we can compare them. Do we have a process like that, just like we do in businesses?
We do. And I think it's spectacularly important and spectacularly effective. And it dates back to Ronald Reagan, an executive order that Ronald Reagan issued, and it was reissued by Bill Clinton and by Barack Obama. Ronald Reagan set up an office in the Office of Management and Budget called the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. OIRA is the acronym. Yeah. And they are the gatekeeper for these regulations. So every regulatory agency that promulgates a economically significant piece of regulation, like a cafe standard or a carbon standard or a new healthcare rule, they have to do a really serious cost-benefit analysis in which they calculate what you said, the net present value of the benefits versus the costs. And they have to compare that against alternatives. And if they don't do that right, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs can send it back. And if they don't do that right, they can get sued in court and have the regulation sent back to the agency. So it's taken really seriously. There are good engineers and good economists at the agencies that work on these things. They're 900-page long documents with charts and tables and graphs and everything you want to know about the industry. So this is it's a serious process, and I think it's pretty well done in a lot of cases.
Yeah. So let me push on this a little bit, Arik. So, in companies, we do this. We have a lot of spreadsheets. We have a lot of finance and accounting folks who do these models. But oftentimes, nothing is deterministic, right? We have uncertainty, we have flexibility, we have sequential decision making. What companies hold are options, not cash flows. And hence, at the end of the day, when it kind of rises up to the CEO level, he or she makes a gut-based decision, based on experience. What is an equivalent process in the government? We can't really create an NPV the way that we do net present value because there's so much uncertainty, so much feedback processes going on in the policies. How do they incorporate those things?
They incorporate it in a couple of ways. Some of them is just doing sensitivity analysis. So we think that people will drive 10% less in response to a doubling of the gas tax. What if it's only 5% or what if it's 20%? So we can put both those in the table and look at the different parameters. And no one of these cost benefit, they're called regulatory impact analyses. None of these regulatory impact analyses exist without abundant sensitivity, different states of the world.
Yeah. And so, but we have, so your efforts here, right from the Obama administration, have they been successful in convincing policymakers of your ideas that, taxing gas would be less regressive?
Well, so let me back up a second. So you said that the analysts can do whatever they want, but it goes up to the decision makers, the CEO of the company. And that's true at the federal government level as well.
Yeah.
The Trump administration wanted to roll back the fuel economy standards that were set by the Obama administration. And so they went to the EPA and the Department of Transportation. They said, in order to roll back a regulation, you have to do the same serious analysis as was done to enact the regulation in the first place. And so the analysts did the regulation. It was the same analysts who had done the analysis to put the regulation forward in the first place that had net benefits that were positive. And so undoing the regulation would reduce those, would have net costs.
Yeah.
And in fact, that's what the Department of Transportation's regulatory impact analysis showed. It showed this will be net harmful to American car consumers. And yet the OMB passed it and President Trump signed it, and it was finalized as a regulation. Now it's this week in the news, it's come under scrutiny because some of the EPA analysts were complained about the process and were left out of the loop on that process. But the analysis was done. It showed net costs. It went to the CEO, which was in this case the president, and the president signed it anyway.
Yeah, I sometimes think the simpler solutions are always better. And so even if I don't have all your analysis, I would say some sort of a consumption tax on gas or some sort of carbon emission tax would be the simplest, high compliance, very easily understood, is likely to be the optimum policy. But it's not that simple, is it?
It's simple economically. It's just not simple politically.
It's not simple politically, yeah. So we have to somehow figure out a way to. Are you optimistic that, from an economics perspective, we have the best researchers in the world, we have the best understanding how complex systems work, but our policies haven't been that great. Are you optimistic that we would get better?
Depends on what day of the week it is, I guess.
Right. So, okay. So we'll take a quick break, Arik. So when we come back, we'll talk about your recent paper,
Okay.
Evidence from American Drivers.
Good.
Thanks.
This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com.
So we're back. Arik, we were talking about energy efficiency, policies around energy efficiency, environmental degradation, and sometimes the simpler and more optimum policies like a gas tax or a carbon tax, as opposed to more complex things like CAFE standards and variety of other things. At least it appeared to be more optimum, but it's very difficult to get them passed from a political perspective with politicians with 4-year horizons for decisions. You have another paper in 2021, Who Values Future Energy Savings? Evidence from American Drivers, in which you say regulators attest that energy efficiency standards save consumers money. More efficient light bulbs, appliances, and vehicles would cost more upfront but reduce energy expenses by enough to compensate. But using data on American drivers and cars, you show this is generally true, but only on average. Um, so when you look at the distribution, so what do you find?
Well, this is a nice segue from what we were just talking about, because we were talking about those detailed regulatory impact analyses that agencies do before they promulgate a new regulation. So if the Department of Energy is going to regulate the efficiency of light bulbs, they do one of these cost-benefit analyses. The light bulbs will cost more, but they will save electricity over the life of the bulb. The air conditioner will cost more, but it'll save energy over the life of the air conditioner. And a curious feature of all of those, without exception, is that the cost savings in the future energy are more than enough to compensate for the extra expenditures for the upfront appliance, the upfront light bulb, upfront cost of the air conditioner.
Like if you buy a hybrid and it costs you $3,000 more, but it's going to be more efficient, so you're going to get the money back in a few years or something like that.
Exactly. And so that raises a puzzle in economists' mind as to why people aren't doing it anyway. Why do we have to regulate this industry? If this is a product that is good for customers, why do we have to force companies to sell this product, to manufacture and sell this product? There are a bunch of explanations. One of the explanations is financing costs. It's people have to borrow to buy their cars, and they therefore, if those costs are expensive, it may be cheaper to buy the less expensive car, even though it costs you more in the long run, than to finance the extra cost of the hybrid, because the savings wouldn't justify those financing costs. And I have a PhD student who's writing a dissertation about exactly that point and finding that that isn't the explanation for the puzzle.
Yeah.
What Lutz Sager, my colleague at Georgetown, and I find in this paper is that we look at the claim for automobiles about that the extra expenditure on the upfront cost of the car would more than justify the future savings. And we point out that that depends on how much you're going to drive. So if you're planning on driving every day a long distance to work, that buying a fuel efficient vehicle would clearly pay for itself, because the cost savings of that gasoline not consumed would be high. But if you're the kind of person who bikes to work most days, as I do, and doesn't live very far from work, and the car sits in the driveway most of the time, buying a fuel efficient car doesn't make any economic sense for personal finance reasons. And so we look at the customers. We know we have data on how far people drive and what kind of cars they're driving, and we would expect to see that the people who drive more are in the more energy efficient cars. And that turns out not to be true at all.
Yeah, that's really surprising. But it also depends on the discount rates that they apply on the future stream of savings, right? So I'm thinking the discount rate might also be changing over time. So humans with finite horizons, that discount rate will continue to increase as you look forward.
That's exactly right. And no analysis of a current cost versus a future expenditure would be complete without a discussion of the discount rates. And Lutz and I do in this paper exactly what I described with those regulatory impact analysis, is we have sensitivity tests. We say, what if the discount rate were 10% instead of 5%, or 2% instead of 5%? And no matter what we do, we get the same answer, which is that how much people are driving is almost uncorrelated with the fuel efficiency of the cars they drive. By contrast, whether they have a college degree, how old they are, their sex, whether male or female, those are correlated with buying fuel efficient cars, buying hybrids versus regular cars, buying fuel efficient versions of regular cars versus inefficient versions of regular cars. So our punchline is the demographics is predicting vehicles' fuel economy, not the cost savings.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So it has broad implications, I think. One implication is that, as you say, education, your knowledge, or whatever, you're not really firing up that Excel spreadsheet, doing a discounted cash flow analysis when you make that decision. The decision is more potentially emotion driven rather than economics driven. Would you say that's true?
It is, but I'm going to push back a little bit on it because economists realize that nobody fires up the Excel spreadsheet when they go to the grocery store to buy cornflakes, or to buy, any product. That people don't behave like people don't do the calculus problem to figure out their optimal consumption of Coca-Cola. But at the margin, on average, it seems to work pretty well for most goods. And in this case, it doesn't.
It doesn't. Yeah, that's so interesting, Arik. So what do you attribute that to? Well, why is it not working here?
It's not that so I attribute it to a couple of things. One is that it's not that salient. The future savings are, people are bad at making current versus future decisions. And this one is particularly not that salient. It's uncertain because I don't know how much I'm going to drive in the future, and I don't know how much the gas prices are going to go up or down. And people are bad at assessing uncertainty. And the third thing is that those vehicle characteristics are highly correlated. We try to control for all of the other characteristics of a vehicle that are correlated with their fuel economy, like how big and powerful they are and so forth. But some of those things are unseen by us, and they may be correlated with the fuel economy of the vehicle, and that's what people are really judging it on. So, one of the curiosities for us is that some cars come exactly the same car comes as both a hybrid or a gas-powered version. And we can look at who's making the financially costly decision of buying the wrong kind of car, either driving a hybrid when they don't buying the hybrid when they don't drive very many miles, or buying the gas car when they drive a lot. Those are financially costly decisions. And men are more likely to make the decision of buying the fuel efficient car, the hybrid, even though they don't drive it much. And women are more likely to make the other type of costly decision. But when we look at regular cars, not the hybrid versus gas powered trade-off, but think of two nearly equivalent cars of the same size and power, one's more efficient than the other. Men are more likely to make the decision, the costly decision of buying the more gas consuming car, and women are more likely to make the costly decision of buying the more efficient car when they don't drive it much. So the roles reverse. It must be something innate about, I don't know, fear of the technology of the new hybrid, or I like the rumble of a gas guzzling car. It's something else is going on that's driving this decision that isn't in our spreadsheets.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, it touches on a lot of different things, right? So I'll throw another thing into this, Arik, for discussion. The American optimism is that we are all going to be millionaires. And so, almost every American doesn't want taxes to rise for millionaires because they believe they're all going to be millionaires. And it's a good trait because we are optimistic about our future. But it is sort of irrational optimism in some ways. And I wonder if irrational optimism is figuring into these decisions.
Is it irrational optimism? I hadn't thought about that. um, yeah, I just, I would, so here I'm speculating.
Yeah.
The paper is very, it's an economics paper, so it's very circumscribed, and we're cautious about interpreting our results. And what we show in the paper is fairly narrow, which is that people don't seem to make decisions about what car to drive based on their future fuel costs. So anything I say beyond that is pure speculation. But you asked, so I'll speculate.
Yes.
I just think there are, in addition to being optimistic, Americans have been, American culture has been a car culture for a long time.
Yes. Yeah.
That's changing a little bit among the youth, but America is still a car country. And the car you drive signifies the kind of person you are.
Yes.
And so people buy cars for things, color, size, noise, street appeal, that are unrelated to they're willing to pay a lot for the image that their car projects. Think of all the people who drive four-wheel drive vehicles but never put it into four-wheel drive.
It's like the clothing. They're wearing the car.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so that creates a lot of noise into the data in some sense.
Noise, and it's expensive noise, especially if the attributes they like in their vehicles make them not very cost effective or not very fuel efficient.
Yeah. I find it really interesting that you can take the demographics except the gender out of the analysis, in terms of education and wealth and things like that. But you find, essentially the same things in spite of those factors in it. Which means that it is somewhat generic expectation, right? You could almost predict what could happen here.
Yeah, I could, based on what we've done so far, but what we've done so far is historical, and fads change.
Yes.
Right. So I just read that Ford is not making any sedans, and so that what they used to sell was sedans, and now they're not going to make sedans. So the fad has changed.
Yeah. So from a policy perspective, I was thinking, I'm stretching this a bit, Arik, so you can stop me if you like. But so suppose I say I can predict who is going to make a bad choice here based on factors I can observe. Maybe I can prevent that. I can take counteractive actions against that. Do you think that's possible in the future?
Interesting. I don't know. I will tell you an anecdote. I think that this paper was motivated, in my mind, in part by walking around my neighborhood of Northwest Washington, D.C., where I have tons of neighbors who are on the liberal end of the spectrum. I see lots of people with electric cars or hybrids, and nobody drives very far. Lots of my neighbors bike to work, and so they leave their electric car parked in the driveway. And so they're making that bad choice. But what they're doing is signaling to their neighbors that they're environmentally friendly.
Yes.
And that's not a bad thing. I don't want to, if it's a culture of, if the culture of environmental friendliness is out there, and that that causes people to do things that are good for the environment, I wouldn't want to punish that. But the way we've set up our fuel economy standard, so this goes back to the previous paper now, that choice is really bad for the environment, because the way our CAFE standards work, our fuel economy standards work, is they're fleet-wide averages. So Toyota has to sell cars that average a certain mile per gallon. And if I buy a fuel-efficient Toyota and leave it parked in the driveway, that means Toyota gets to sell a gas-guzzling car to somebody else who presumably is going to drive it a lot. So what I should really do, if I cared a lot about the environment, is buy the most gas-guzzling car I can and leave it parked in my driveway and never use it. And that would force Toyota to, or whoever it was, to sell a fuel-efficient car to somebody else who would presumably drive it. And that would be the wrong signal, right? It would tell it to my neighbors. They would look and they would say, look, Arik has this gas guzzler and he has this Humvee in his driveway. What a terrible person he is.
Right. Yeah. So my speculation, is that cars are like clothing, and cars are like houses that you live in. Then what the neighborhoods that you bought your house, it's sort of a signal of who you are as a person. It is not an economic decision. It's sort of an advertisement of who you are. And if you do that, you're probably going to end up with from an economic perspective, wrong choices.
And it's part of the fact that we haven't taxed the externality, because people do respond to prices. And so adding a cost of doing that wrong thing would get some people at the margin to make better decisions.
Right. So in conclusion, let me put you on the spot. So if you were to advise the Biden administration today, what would be the features from a sort of an environmental perspective that you would be most interested in to become sort of a law or a policy choice?
I would say that if we're not going to impose a carbon tax, that we should have a set of analyses that mimic what a carbon tax would do. And what a carbon tax would do is it equates the cost, the incremental cost or marginal cost of cleaning up pollution via all the different mechanisms. And so if there's a mechanism that's particularly costly per ton of carbon abated, we should do less of that. And if there's a mechanism that's particularly inexpensive per ton of carbon abated, we should do more of it. An example is the retrofitting homes for energy efficiency. The Obama administration in the Recovery Act had a lot of money for retrofitting homes to be more energy efficient. That has been shown to be a very costly way of reducing carbon emissions, because the energy savings aren't nearly what they were promised to be.
Yeah.
The Biden administration, I think, is now planning to propose to retrofit 4 million homes. I would do less of things like that and more of the things that are less expensive to do.
Yeah, I mean, it is sort of disappointing. I mean, we have feel-good policies. Feel-good policies always sell. Analytically driven, quantitatively supported policies don't. And so, what politicians have figured out is, they gravitate towards sort of the feel-good policies, and they're always going to be suboptimum.
They are. There's a sweet spot of policies that feel good and maybe cost effective, and I guess that's the job of the politicians, to find those.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, this has been great, Arik. Thanks so much for spending time with me.
Very nice talking with you.
Thank you.
This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com.